Learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to, number 1, know the concept of the social welfare function, 2, understand the meaning of the Ricardian equivalence, 3, identify theoretical issues, and finally, evaluate the empirical evidence. And now we come to the introduction. A frequent theme of policy discussion is in regard to public debt. In the general course of discussion, public debt is often blamed as a reason for the cause of recessions, unemployment, inflation, high rates of interest, trade deficits, etc. For decades, economists have had a straightforward theory of the effects of public debt, that is, as defined in the Keynesian model. On the one hand, public debt stimulated the economy in the short run by making households feel wealthier. On the other hand, however, public debt competed with private debt for the available funds, driving up the rates of interest and crowding out private investment from the market. Over the last 15 years, however, the standard model has been challenged by economists using the concepts of Ricardian equivalence, suggesting therefore that the public debt has none of the effects as accorded to it by the traditional theory. While on the one hand, traditional theory attributes an increase in the deficit caused by the increased government expenditure or a reduction in taxes to create a short-run stimulus to output and employment, on the other hand, a rise in the rates of interest and the crowding out of private investment hinders and causes a recession. Yet, on the other hand, Ricardian equivalence, as it came to be called, attributes no effect at all. According to the Ricardian equivalence, increased government purchases and hence increased debt to tax ratio is irrelevant. This is so because the debt incurred implies future taxes and that the present value of future additional taxes equals the present value of the additional debt. Hence, rational agents will proceed as if the additional governmental expenditure was not debt financed and the government debt did not exist, resulting in government debt having no effect on the economic activity whatsoever. The Ricardian equivalence theory in itself is very controversial because it doesn't hold exactly. The theoretical foundations for any effect of public debt on the economy depend on a whole lot of factors such as intergenerational altruism, family relations, the nature and extent of the liquidity constraints, and various kinds of uncertainty on the household's maximization decisions. Such factors determine that this theory is implausible. The essence of the theory lies very much on the way the society behaves. If the society changes its behavior regarding the issue and the retirement of debt, the significance of effects of debt may actually emerge. Now we come to the third para, which is the meaning of the Ricardian equivalence. Central to the Ricardian theory of equivalence is that a rational individual should be indifferent between paying ₹1 in tax today and paying ₹1 plus interest in taxes tomorrow. In other words, the timing of the given amount of taxes have no effect whatsoever on an individual's lifetime budget. Since the timing of the taxes have no effect on an individual's lifetime budget constraint, it cannot alter his consumption decisions. In its modern form, Ricardian equivalence is a generalization of the permanent income hypotheses come life cycle hypotheses. Indeed, it can be regarded as a logical completion of these models with government purchases, debt and taxation being included. Ricardian equivalence is based on a lot of assumptions of individual behavior. The Ricardian view proposes that the substitution of budget deficit for the current taxes or an alternative temporal arrangement has an equal effect on aggregate demand. Thus, the two are equivalent. A decline in taxation by the government implies a current budget deficit with future tax implications. Rational consumers recognize that these future taxes have a present value equal to the incurred debt. Thus, they see through the intertemporal veil, saving the additional disposable income to pay the future taxes rather than raising their current consumption. It is an action that is equivalent to paying current taxes. The rise in private saving exactly offsets the fall in public saving, and therefore aggregate demand remains unchanged. Summarily, the rational and forward-looking household does not perceive government debt as net wealth. According to the Ricardian equivalence theory, debt-financed fiscal policy would not raise aggregate demand and therefore have no short-run effects on either employment or output. The Ricardian model is as follows. The basic model considers an infinitely lived individual household which maximizes its intertemporal utility, with no government utility maximization to follow. That is, it is possible to write it in the form of an equation. Capital U of t, which is the intertemporal utility function, is equal to summation from periods I equal to 1 to infinity of small u, which is the intratemporal utility, based on the consumption from period t plus I, appropriately modified by what is called time preference, written here as delta superscript I. Now this would be obviously subject to its lifetime constraint. How do we write this lifetime as a constraint? It's very simple. Again, we take the sum of the stream of incomes from t plus I, appropriately discounted by the appropriate rate of discount, and this should be equal to the sum period I to period infinity of capital C t plus I, written in the form of a subscript, where C subscript t plus I represents the consumption in all those periods, appropriately also discounted by the appropriate rate of discount. Now in this equation, remember, capital U is the intertemporal utility function, small u is the intratemporal utility function, capital C is the consumption, Y is total income, delta is time preference factor, R is the discount rate. The assumption of an infinitely lived household implies a continual succession of generations, with all generations having the same preferences and intergenerational altruism, so that it can be treated as a single timeless entity. The utility maximization problem can be solved by using a Lagrangian. The Lagrangian has the equation L is equal to capital U of t plus lambda, within brackets, summation of the stream of income from period t plus I, ranging from period I equal to 1 to infinity, appropriately discounted over all the periods, minus the summation of the stream of consumption, that is given by C subscript t plus I, again ranging from period 1 to infinity, appropriately discounted. And this we can maximize over the consumption C, and in this, lambda is the Lagrangian multiplier. The government can be incorporated in this model in a very simplistic manner by assuming that Y stands for disposable income inclusive of interest received on government debt. C stands for private consumption, and the present value of government expenditure equals the value of taxes corrected for interest to be paid on government borrowing. In evaluating the existing theory and evidence on Ricardian equivalence, it is important to distinguish between the short-run effects of the government borrowing and its long-run effects. The central Ricardian observation is that deficits merely postpone the taxes. Some important assumptions that are made are: successive generations are linked by altruistically motivated transfers. Capital markets are perfect. The postponement of taxes does not redistribute the resources amongst the generations. Taxes are non-distortionary. The use of the deficit cannot create value, and consumers are rational as well as far-sighted. These conditions have to be explained. First, let us take the intergenerational linkages. In an overlapping generation 2 period lifespan model of the economy as presented by Samuelson in his 1958 publication, agents would experience a net wealth effect from a deficit finance tax decrease. Agents would be aware that the future tax liability would be borne by future generations, allowing individuals to utilize additional disposable income without redemption. That is, they would care only about their own utility. Therefore, one of the necessary conditions of Ricardian equivalence is that it is based on intergenerational altruism, where households act as though they are infinitely lived. This indicates that individuals would save the additional disposable income and bequeath it to their children in order to cover the future tax liability of the current debt. However, the implausibility of this assumption highlights its potential as a failure of the Ricardian equivalence. With regard to the first component, one line of criticism argues that under plausible assumptions about preferences, productivity growth, and income distribution, many parents will bequeath nothing to their children. The relevant issue thus concerns about the likelihood of transfer flows neither from parents to children, nor for that matter from children to parents. Furthermore, this entire sub-literature considers a very special subset of preferences in the direct altruism is generally limited to one's immediate successor and predecessors. In other words, it does not go throughout all generations but is limited to one's immediate successors and one's immediate predecessors. It is argued that the ubiquitous parent-child linkages would embed on nearly all individuals in a single interconnected network. The consumption of each individual then would depend only upon the total wealth, and the incremental to the total wealth would be divided among the entire population. Consequently, in a large dynamic economy, any incremental bequest would be divided between the recipient's contemporaries, and the resulting increment to the recipient's consumption would be negligible. Accordingly, the donor would prefer to make no bequests at all. In equilibrium, many donors would be driven to the corners so that no large interconnected network would actually remain. Then we come to the perfect capital market. The Ricardian equivalence model assumes no elements of capital imperfections. Hence, there will be no borrowing constraints that will be faced by the agents, and that they will base their consumption on the lifetime expected income. However, Buter and Tobin in their 1981 publication state that realistically financial markets do not offer unlimited opportunities for constrained households to consume future incomes through borrowings. Some proportion of the individuals will always be liquidity constrained. One of the examples of a constraint is credit rationing, where borrowers are withheld loans even when they are willing to pay above the market rate of interest. Fiscal policy will then have a net wealth effect, even when the future tax implications are perfectly foreseen. According to a study done by King, which was published in 1983, it summarizes that across various data, 20 to 25% of the people may not be consuming or saving optimally because they are facing borrowing constraints. And this indicates that wealth effect then would be significant. These would raise their consumption despite a future burden in case they are given a relief in terms of lesser taxes. This is a compelling argument and represents a failure of the Ricardian equivalence. Unfortunately, the studies are somewhat unsatisfactory in that they take the liquidity constraints to be taken as something exogenous. Certainly, the effect of government policy will in general depend upon the nature of the capital market failures which give rise to inefficiencies. Now let us consider redistribution. Even if individuals are infinitely lived and capital markets are perfect, the deferral of taxes through deficits may alter the pattern of incidence. Simply put, different people may bear a larger share of the tax burden at different points of time. In effect, all the real effects of the debt described so far arise from redistribution of this sort, either between successive generations or between separate incarnations of the same individual in distinct periods. Certain considerations suggest that the debt and social security may stimulate aggregate consumption by redistributing resources towards individuals with higher marginal propensities to consume. For this, you are referred to the articles by Abel in 1986 and the second article that he wrote in 1985. These policies also tend to favor policies with few children, and this may affect the fertility, therefore altering the consumption indirectly. In this connection, please read Becker and Barrow. Their article was written in 1985, as well as Wilderson, which article also came in 1985. It is, however, difficult to gauge the quantitative importance of these effects. Future taxes may also be uncertain because they are related to income, which itself is random. In this case, postponement of taxes may result in the reduction of future net income risk, thereby inducing a rise in consumption. Distortionary taxes is the next thing that we are going to take. The timing of taxes may be quite important. If taxes distort behavior and if marginal future taxes depend upon different decisions than the current marginal taxes, then there can be distortion. This observation is especially relevant to the current discussion when deficits are used to postpone capital income taxes, since a reduction in marginal capital income rates may cause individuals to save more and consume less. A more general treatment of deficit financing in a world with distortionary taxes gives rise to the theory of tax smoothing. This theory suggests that the tax rate should be kept relatively constant even when the output fluctuates. Intuitively, since the dead weight loss of taxation rises approximately with the square of the tax rate, a constant rate minimizes the average distortion. While tax smoothing is an important normative concept, this theory does not appear to generate any clear positive implications concerning the link between deficits and aggregate consumption. A separate set of issues arises when the distribution of future taxes is not known with certainty. This has been dealt by Buter and Tobin in their 1981 article. To the extent that consumers save more as a precaution against uncertainty, deficits may actually crowd in investment. This is, please in this case, read Chan's 1983 publication. Although, once again, it is difficult to assess the quantitative significance of this factor, it is found that this argument is implausible. If the world was otherwise Ricardian, then one would never expect to observe deficits, since the electorate would universally oppose the gratuitous introduction of uncertainty. Rather, huge current surpluses would result from the public's desire to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible. Future taxes may also be uncertain because they are related to income, which itself is random. In this case, the postponement of taxes may result in a reduction of future net income risk, thereby inducing a rise in consumption. If a deficit were to rise in the initial period, either as a result of increased governmental expenditure or because of a reduction in taxes, and if the households were to save the increase in the disposable income to meet increased taxes in the subsequent periods, then too the equivalence would not hold if the interest income on the extra savings were to be taxed. This is because the tax would then alter the price of the subsequent period consumption in terms of the initial period consumption, and hence the slope of the intertemporal budget constraint. Now let's look at permanent postponement. Feldstein in 1976 criticized Barrow's analysis of fiscal policy by arguing that when growth rate of the economy exceeds the interest rate, the government can roll over deficits indefinitely. As a result, no generation need ever actually pay any portion of the postponed taxes. Barrow in 1976 responded to this criticism to say that intergenerational linkages might actually prevent the economy from accumulating an inefficiently large amount of capital. While one can draw any conclusion from the form of intergenerational altruism or the pervasiveness of intergenerational linkages from this literature, it can be convinced that 2 points are now well established. One, contrary to Barrow's conjecture, intergenerational altruism does not rule out dynamically inefficient outcomes. Indeed, for a certain specification of preferences, it is possible to obtain inefficient equilibria with either positive gifts. For this, see Weil 1984 and Abel 1985, or alternatively with positive bequests. For this, see Ray 1987. Secondly, even when the economy over-accumulates capital, Ricardian equivalence still holds as long as successive generations are operatively linked. In this connection, you may read Carmichael 1982's article and Bernheim and Bagwell 1986. Key to the second result is that the government cannot, in the absence of other market failures, alter the aggregate opportunity set of the private sector through borrowing. If voluntary transfers are operative, then the individual families could mimic a policy of rolling over deficits. Now let's consider the factor called myopia. For Ricardian equivalence to hold, it is clearly essential for the consumers to be both highly rational as well as far-sighted. While the rational expectations hypothesis is much in vogue, one should be aware that alternative behavioral hypotheses have very different implications. For instance, see Sheffrin and Thaler 1985. For example, consumers may simply choose consumption heuristically on the basis of current disposable income and may fail completely to appreciate the link between current deficit and future taxes. If so, the more traditional Keynesian view of deficits is appropriate. Please, in this connection, read Blinder and Solo 1973. Now let's consider political processes. Politicians may generally support various costly programs but oppose current tax increases. When it is possible to run deficits, these two positions are at least logically consistent. Thus, the availability of deficit financing may profoundly affect the size and the composition of the government. In this connection, your attention is raised towards Buchanan and Wagner 1977, Bone 1985, Alesina and Tabellini 1987. Of course, it is difficult to explain such behavior on part of the politicians without attributing appropriate views to the electorate. One is therefore naturally led to the issue raised in the preceding subsections. For example, non-neutrality as in Aracena and Tabellini 1987, which they say results from the absence of non-distortionary taxes. It is nevertheless important to bear in mind the potential endogeneity of governmental expenditures. Now let's consider consumer rationality. An assumption of Ricardian equivalence, which is in line with rational expectation hypotheses, is that consumer rationality, as outlined under a macroeconomic setting. In this case, the agent's expectations around the future economically related variables are correct on an average, with errors being random and not systematic. This indicates that the consumer has the ability to fully anticipate future tax implications of a deficit finance tax cut. Ricardo himself criticized this theory by stating that people who pay taxes never so estimate them and therefore do not manage their private affairs accordingly. And this signaled his doubt that consumers would act in a far-sighted manner as predicted by rational expectations hypothesis. The idea is that not all consumers act in a rational, far-sighted manner. It would seem that a rise in disposable income from a deficit finance tax cut would have a net wealth effect for some at least, leading to the failure of the Ricardian equivalence. Now let us consider the empirical evidence. A careful reading of the literature reveals that conflicting results on the validity of the Ricardian equivalence are often attributable to the problem of measurement and econometric methodology. While the former are sometimes difficult to handle and clear-cut solutions may not exist, progress in econometric theory has been rapid since early 1980s, and much of the inference drawn in older time series studies is now known to be invalid. Even though a wide battery of different tests exists, most researchers apply just one sort of a test to a specific data set, as other studies mostly differ not only by the sample but also by the data set, and as well as the type of test employed. It is generally difficult to assess how much evidence a given set of papers assembles in favor or against the Ricardian equivalence. For empirical matters, Ricardian equivalence can sensibly be stated only with reference to a specific data set. Now let us summarize what we have so far said. While attempts to measure the effects of deficits directly may face insuperable difficulties, they do supply one more piece of the overall picture. A succession of studies has established the existence of a robust short-run relationship between deficits and aggregate consumption. While there are many potential explanations for this pattern, it is at very least consistent with the traditional Keynesian view. Results for interest rates are mixed and considerably more difficult to interpret. Thus, while time series evidence weighs against the Ricardian equivalence, it does not by itself tip the scales. However, in the context of theoretical reasoning and behavioral analysis, a coherent picture emerges in which the Ricardian outcome appears relatively unlikely. Recent experience confirms this evaluation. During the 80s, deficits and interest rates rose dramatically while saving rates plummeted. For this connection, please read Poterba and Summers 1986 or Feldstein, the second article in 1986 for the discussion. This period was relatively unique in United States history. Large deficits resulted from declines in net revenue rather than temporary increases in government spending, so that it presents us with a fairly clean experiment. This interpretation of the 80s is of course controversial, and formal statistical analysis have produced conflicting results. For instance, compare Evans 1985 and the second article of 1986b with Feldstein, the second article of 1986b. One key issue in the controversy concerns the timing. When exactly did taxpayers begin to anticipate large deficits? To believe that changes in expectations were approximately coincident with movements in interest rates and savings, indeed, more recently real interest rates and deficit projections have fallen together, although the direction of the causal reasons is perhaps not clear. Since this issue is extremely difficult to resolve, we are likely to learn more from the longer-term movements in deficits than from the very short-term movements. Therefore, one is particularly struck by the comparison of the 80s with the earlier periods. There is no question whatsoever that the expected deficits, interest rates, and consumption have all, on an average, been significantly higher since 1982 in the United States than, for an example, in the 1970s. While this is conceivably attributable to spurious factors, the comparison is highly suggestive. Ricardian equivalence is the concept that deficit finance tax cuts are treated as equivalent to deferred taxes by rational consumers. The additional disposable income is simply saved to pay the created future tax implications. This is based on several implausible assumptions, which realistically lead to failures of equivalence. Intergenerational linkages do not always see real capital transfers between generations due to the cost of human capital, for instance. Observed also is that some individuals have no children and some parents leave no bequests. This results in a net wealth effect for those individuals as the tax is cut, and therefore this difference can be spent. Perfect capital markets do not exist in real life, and consumers may see a net wealth effect if they can't borrow against future income. And this wealth effect comes with a tax cut. Where previously these consumers were constrained to their current income alone, now with a tax cut, they are in a position to spend more. And this is because private capital markets do not give them or do not extend them any loans against future incomes. Lastly, the rational expectations hypothesis provides a controversial basis for the Ricardian equivalence model. On the whole, there is by no means an unchallenged theory of consumer behavior given by the Ricardian equivalence. While several counter-arguments exist, the weight of evidence means that three assumptions represents situations of total specific failure of the Ricardian equivalence.